Hi, I'm Tanner, and today I hope to give you knowledge about zoos in the United States and hope with your help to join me in pushing for policy to regulate or remove them. The biggest threat of wildlife has come from people. Human and animals have always had a strong bond since the beginning of time, but the biggest threat of wildlife comes from people. For example, King Henry III had a strong connection to exotic animals, polar bears, leopards, and lions, just to name a few. But they say a king who was a good hunter was a good warrior because he protected his people. Kings were known to kill lions and other large exotic animals just to show their physical prowess. This is what I believe began centuries of cruel enjoyment and treatment needed, and because we felt like we needed some sense of control over these animals. This also led to the first zoo being built in 1793 in Paris. The first zoo in Paris had very small confined spaces and threw random species of animals together on display for people to enjoy, obviously not considering the physical and psychological impact it had on these animals. I believe zoos should never have been created and in modern day to either be abolished or strongly regulated through sanctions and regulations through our federal government for reasons of psychological impact, physical impact, and the pure lack of justification behind having most of these animals in the first place. I ask for you to consider and ponder the idea of pushing policy towards and preventing and or regulating zoos in America. First, let's talk about the psychological impact of animals in zoos in captivity. We start by defining zoochosis. Zoochosis, according to idusa.org, is defined as a mental anguish made visible by normal behavior and is a common indicator of poor welfare. Zoochosis is not found in the wild. It is only found in zoo animals. So often signs how we find out that animals are suffering with zoochosis is by seeing that they show pacing, rocking, and overgrooming. Zoochosis is caused by captivity. Animals in zoos are limited to lives of sensory deprivation. We often separate them from their families and limit their ability to realize their needs or desires to make decisions or any meaningful work. We give them a dull, unideal environment, which leads them to these mental illness developments. To me, it is apparent that these zoos are built for profit and not for welfare. There's research that shows that only 4% of zoo revenue actually goes back to benefiting these animals. If the zoos are receiving so much revenue, then why are the exhibits small and not suitable for the animals? And lastly, I'd like to say the fact that according to National Geographic, only 80% of zoo animals are characterized by some form of zoochosis. But animals in zoos are not only affected psychologically, they're also affected physically, which brings me to my second point. Is it strange to think of seeing an elephant running, right? Well, in fact, the Asian elephant can actually run up to 15 miles per hour. If you think about it, there's so many animals that need these physical exercise, hunting and running, like lions and leopards and cheetahs, but they don't really have the space, and it's not possible for zoos to be big enough to meet the needs of these animals. Obviously, these animals are not happy, and there's a whole list of common disorders and procedures that have to be done just on zoo animals because they're not meeting their physical needs. Overall, there are many physical problems of keeping animals in captivity, and the pros outweigh the cons. If needed to be in place, there could always be programs in place that can help these endangered animals be put in smaller captivity spots for research purposes. The knowledge we know of the psychological and physical impact on animals in zoos give plenty of reasons to be against them. But I would like to make one more key point on why I believe we shouldn't have zoos. Lastly, I believe there's a lack of justification. Before I go to that, I would like to read this quote. Michael J. Fox, who's an advocate for animals and a retired actor, says, zoos are becoming a factoid or perhaps caricatures of how animals once were in their natural habitat. If the right policies towards nature were pursued, we would need no zoos at all. All right, let's talk about the justification. Some zoos have justified themselves as saying they're useful for conservation, education, and research, which they often repeat. They say that zoos educate the public and foster an appreciation of other species. The zoos save endangered species by bringing them into a safe environment. But I like to ask the question, how many % of zoo animals are actually endangered? Aren't there better ways to conserve these animals than to educate? We can use virtual reality or smaller projects in the animal, and having animals in their natural habitat, like sanctuaries, would be more beneficial to the education and the lives of these animals. If animals are used for non-profitable purposes, then why do we charge outrageous prices to go to them? To me, it seems that zoos aim to turn a profit than for the sake of the animals. They try to justify themselves by claiming to be necessary to protect these animals, when most of the animals kept in zoos survive fine in the wild. What can you do? The federal law in place right now, the Animal Welfare Act, states that they only require the minimum standards of care for these animals. And there's only one federal policy actually in place for animals in zoos. What we can do is write to our state representatives to help push policy, more federal policy, to protect these animals. Some organizations that I found that are supporting this cause is the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Quoted from them, they say that the Animal Defense Fund works at the federal, state, and local levels to advance important legislation. We advocate for laws, promote and protect lives and interests of animals. We oppose legislation that would be detrimental to animals' well-being. Not only, but they also bring up the idea of an animal bill of rights, and they ask people to sign this animal bill of rights. In summary, I would like to say there are countless reasons for shutting down and pushing policy to prevent zoos. The psychological, physical impact on these animals, and the lack of justification behind having most of these animals in the first place are just a few of many examples why I'm trying to push this call to action. Lastly, I just say my call to action is we must write to push for the positions and policies we would support by writing U.S. senators and representatives. Thank you.